As Brent mentioned, I spent a lot of time actually talking to DW, but it tends not to be about cybersecurity, but about the latest Trump tweet or the latest State of the Union address or whatever is happening in Washington. So that's the advantage of and disadvantage of being a generalist. I know a little bit about everything, just enough to make me dangerous. But I want to take the topic of the first panel, which was really about people. And Larry asked the question, getting to the intrinsic value of why. What is incentivizing people to do things in cybersecurity? What is motivating decisions? And I think that that's going to be something that's going to inflect our conversation about the threat landscape in next-gen technology. The title of this has come up a couple times, is Paradigm Shifted Needed ? I would say that the actual title should be Paradigm Shift Happening, period. But the question is what are the values motivating that paradigm shift? Is it security? I think we would all say no. It's convenience, it's efficiency, it's satisfaction, it's consumer satisfaction. These are the things that are motivating the shift. So we have a mismatch here. So we're having this paradigm shift. We're entering what I would call a deep digital age. We're going to have at the end of next year 20 billion IoT devices online. We're having a change in the internet infrastructure, which is going to make internet much more quick. IoT, AI, machine learning, blockchain, quantum computing is all changing the way we need to think about the threat landscape. But we still, in the policy community, in the corporate community, and as users, are still in the digital age. And the digital age is about laptops, it's about smartphones, it's about social media. So what we're going to try to do in this session is reconcile the two. No easy task, but we have some really smart people who are going to do that for us. So I'm going to call them up, and as I do, if you guys can come up, take a seat, and we can give them a round of applause. First, Rainer Baumgart. Rainer, come on up. Rainer is the CEO of Secunet, which he joined in 1997, which I think is the year it was founded. He's a physicist by training, and he is one of the members of the NISA stakeholders group. Rainer, please take a seat here. Next, we have Terry Halvorsen. Terry, come on up. All right. Terry is one of those guys who needs no introduction. He has been at Samsung since 2017, where he is the CIO and EVP for the company's IT and mobile B2B group. But he comes from a long career in the military, the U.S. military, and at the DoD, where he was, at the end, the Chief Information Officer of the U.S. military, probably the world's largest platform. Next, we have Dr. Shue-Jane Thompson. Sue, come on up. Shue-Jane is VP and partner for cyber and biometric and U.S. Public Services at IBM, and she's been working in the field for 30 years. She started when she was 5 years old, ladies and gentlemen. 35 years old. Next, we have Gundbert Scherf. Gundbert, come on up. Gundbert? Oh, there he is. He is a partner at McKinsey in Berlin. Yes. Where he leads McKinsey's, or is one of the leads of McKinsey's European cybersecurity practice. From 2014 to 2015, he was at the German Ministry of Defense, where he led efforts to create the cyberspace strategy and cyber information domain command. And last but not least, we have Norbert Gaus. Norbert, where are you? Come on up. Norbert is the executive VP at Siemens Corporate Technology, responsible for R&D for digitization and automation. And he has been at Siemens since 1991, so he really knows the corporation inside and out. So this is the panel. Also started at 5 years old, ladies and gentlemen. We've got another youngin'. All right, so we have a very distinguished panel, so we're going to get into all these technologies, AI, IoT, blockchain, et cetera. But let's start with the hot topic right now. If we talk about being at the present at the creation, we're creating the systems that are going to govern us for the next generation. And one of it, of course, is this Wozniak point, the Wozniak question, faster internet. In the next 6 months, a lot of governments in Europe are going to make a decision about how they want to build their 5G networks. And so I want to start with a question to Terry. Terry, what's at stake here?
I think you should use the microphone.
Yeah. And please, use the mics.
Lots and lots of money.
Okay. Who gets the money?
that's going to be what's at stake. I think there's been enough studies. I tend to agree with the groups that get to, and what we're really talking about here is 5G.
Yep.
The groups that get to 5G and the ecosystem. So just to be a little lengthy, 5G network is not by itself the revolution. It's a convergence of a couple different things. 5G speeds and latency coupled with now the ability to store a massive amounts of data on the edge. And then you throw in our last speaker's topic of AI. That's going to drive economies, business changes. We talk about paradigm shifts. So for fun, as soon as you get driverless cars autonomous, we know that accident rates will go down. What happens to the auto insurance industry? Huge change. I mean, these are all things that are going to happen. And the consumer part of this business is not going to be the first part that we talk about. 5G, all you out there, is not first going to be driven by consumers. 4G was. 5G is going to be driven by governments and industry.
Okay, so we've got 5G being driven by governments and industry. So how do we need to make sure to harden that security as we're building the basic infrastructure that's going to govern us for the next 15 years? What are the concerns that are worrying policymakers?
Well, I think the last panel was really a good topic on that. The concerns are no one really does want to pay for security.
Yeah.
I mean, even in the panel, we heard some members argue that they didn't have to pay for security. I'm not saying it was right or wrong, but they did. We've got to figure out how we're going to explain that this is all going to cost some money.
Right.
And government's going to pay some, industry's going to pay some, and unfortunately, yes, consumers are going to pay some. And how we build that case, how we educate all of the players in that are going to be key. And to date, we frankly have done a pretty poor job on educating people about cybersecurity, including the cybersecurity professionals. So we used to play, I'm a military guy. So as an intel officer, you had to play a game called Bet Your Bars. I had to go brief. In the intelligence business, when I came in, always the junior officer was the intel guy because he was expendable. You went in and you told your commander, I think this is going to happen, and you had to tell him in terms of what he understood. This many people might die, this may happen. My cybersecurity guys would come in and talk to me about 20 minutes of technical risk, and I said, well, what's that mean to my mission? We don't do your mission, I don't know. We got to start talking about this in terms of mission or money.
But just to use an example on 5G in the United States, at least one of the vectors of vulnerability that's discussed is using parts from Huawei. And that has been a case that, at least for good or for evil, has been successful to keep Huawei from being accessing these contracts with companies like Verizon and AT&T. That debate is happening here now. Secretary Pompeo, who will probably be here tomorrow, is making a tour through Central Europe discussing this. Is he right to try to get Huawei excluded from being part of the 5G network in Europe?
You know, from a U.S. government perspective, I guess you'd have to say he's right. That's the U.S. policy. I think a better way to have this discussion, though, is about data sovereignty. So I go out to see lots of international government partners. I'll candidly admit, half of them are just as worried about the U.S. spying on them as they are China.
Yep.
That's a fact. So what we try to talk about at Samsung, what I think the argument ought to be about is, how do you protect government data sovereignty? So we try to go in and tell our government customers, hey, we're going to give you a system that is your system, your key, your protection, and instead of maybe writing about individual companies or systems, there needs to be a description of, here are the things that if you're a government you want. You want access to code. Companies ought to give to government customers, and I'm going to make sure I'm specifically talking about government customers here.
Yeah.
They've got to be willing to give more of their code. You've got to be willing.
But that wasn't enough for the U.S., right?
No, they also wanted to see, but you say it wasn't enough. I will argue that some of the companies that are saying they give code, and I had to see it when I did, didn't actually give me my code. They didn't give the code up. Giving the code up means you really are sharing it. You've got to talk about supply chain. And you've got to be willing to have your factories, your spaces, they ought to be able to be inspected on pretty short notice by governments. There's a list of things I think you would put out, and if everybody plays by those, maybe they should be allowed in.
we're going to get back to this supply chain point in a bit, but I want to go to Rainer and ask about something that came up in the keynote. We're talking about AI and cybersecurity. Can you give us an assessment of, the good guys and the bad guys in AI? How is AI changing the threat matrix online? What is the offensive systems that can be used and what are the defensive?
All technological things have mostly two sides. One of the good side, perhaps to protect more. That means in the case of artificial intelligence, more to better analyze perhaps network infrastructures, to predictive information about perhaps vulnerabilities and so on. Perhaps also in the area of identification of persons, you can use artificial intelligence very well. But on the other hand, I'm absolutely sure that attackers will use the same technology if it is available on the market, and it will be available. It will be open source. It will be no access control for such technologies. Will be used for intelligent attackers to analyze the situation, to find out who are the open doors, and perhaps also to develop special Trojan horses and so on, which have much more chances, not too easy to detect, and perhaps more destroying potentials for critical infrastructures. So it means in combination with high-speed networks, 5G, artificial intelligence could be a risk also for, let's say, our infrastructure. On the other hand, if we use it really in good behavior, perhaps in the automotive sector and so, we can protect our infrastructure with the same technology.
Yeah, Norbert, he talked about critical infrastructure and industrial systems. This is Siemens' bread and butter. What do you think? How is AI changing the landscape?
First, thank you. Then, before I start to talk about AI, maybe I want to disagree with one statement that has been made a few times now. Yeah? On the industrial side, I know definitively that it's not true that nobody wants to spend money on security. We spend a ton of money on security. Now, just in corporate technology, we have more than 200 researchers driving this. We spend money on every product. Yes, we are not perfect. Yeah? We have cross-industry alliances built up with our Charter of Trust, and there's a lot of things going on in worldwide. So the industry is not perfect when it comes to cybersecurity, by far not perfect. Yeah? But we are spending a lot of money in all these areas. Yeah? And artificial intelligence, I think, is definitively one of them. Yeah? We start already to use artificial intelligence in many different ways across everything we do in industry, also in cybersecurity. One way we have, we're working on prototypes already, is to more or less in real time or in almost real time being able to detect malicious data that can be infected into industrial networks. Now, many people have been trying this on classical communication networks for a long time. Industrial networks have a few specifics which we can use that make it much easier to do it in these environments. The networks are very strictly hierarchical. Data structures and data rates are much easier and slower. So we are using this. So detecting attacks much faster is one way where artificial intelligence can really help. But it can also help, and that will be probably the next step we see, is not only detecting attacks, but really understanding from the patterns we see what is the anticipated or the impact the attack tries to have, to build a broader and more comprehensive defense strategy. And the next step we see will then really be what we have been doing in maintenance, for example. Everybody's talking with AI about predictive maintenance. Looking at all the attack patterns, I'm convinced that in the end we will be able to predict from past and current attacks across a large number of also different systems, predict future attack patterns, and then pre-develop potential defense strategies, so that this first mover advantage shrinks, eventually might even become very, very small. Yes, that's a vision, And it will take a while, but artificial intelligence, I think, is here, or one technology that might change the game of this first mover advantage, where the attacker always has the advantage over the defender.
That's interesting. So you're saying that this is leveling back in favor of the defender a little bit.
That's what we would hope, but I would already be happy if the disadvantage is going to go away. If it's equal level, I'd be fine already. And already that will be a lot of work and need a little bit of time.
Gundbert, this idea of supply chains and the role of AI in protecting supply chains was mentioned. How do you see changes in the cybersecurity landscape with these new technologies, but also new logistics systems coming online?
Yeah, and I'm happy to maybe add the business perspective to this. Just for the fun of it, I probably have to disagree with the last statement only of what Dr. Gaus said. I agree with everything else, but I actually think that the gap between defend and offender is probably going to, unfortunately, become bigger. And I think the main reason is that, and I think it was mentioned in the impulse statement, the new technologies are basically just too attractive to resist for business. Just to give you one example, we just looked at AI. AI, I think in the last 1 or 2 years, we see it, we talk about it a lot, has really taken off. And so we looked at McKinsey at the 400 use cases that we could see being reasonably happening in the next years and the value of that. And the big number that comes out of this is that until 2030, Europe alone could add 2.7 trillion euros to its GDP by implementing AI. It doesn't matter whether it's 2.7 or 2.5 trillion, but it's a very big number. And what that means if you're sitting inside a company, and the companies that, of course, I also serve, is that means that the business is firmly in the driver's seat and is pursuing that opportunity, right? And I think that is a major paradigm shift from the digitization wave we've had in the last years, because what it means now is the core business is being digitized, not the periphery. It's not corporate IT we're talking about, so supporting things, but it's actually the product, the production, it's the development processes. And that's a huge paradigm shift. I think we talk a lot about paradigm shifts today for good reason, because that is actually now people in charge of this that have their foot firmly on the accelerator. And the people currently in charge of IT security who have been empowered to do that are actually sitting in IT, because that's what traditionally the challenge has been, right? That's changing now, but it's changing. This is why I would say it's a difficult challenge. It's changing too slowly still from what we see. Largely because the management system to deal with this complexity that we're adding is just taking time to implement. Right? So what you see now, and as the last comment maybe, what you see now in manufacturing and automotive and a lot of these industries is they're changing, but this goes all the way down to the supply chain. It goes into procurement, it goes into development. There's a lot of people needed. You basically need an entirely new management system. I would say the best analogy we have is quality, how we manage quality. I mean, you don't manage quality as an afterthought. You don't look at the infamous German Spaltmaß after you've produced the car, right? But it's actually a paradigm that goes all the way to the very beginning when you design it. I think that shift is, I'm afraid, going to take time. And at the same time, the business is going to keep its foot on the accelerator.
Yeah, this is what essentially what we talk about when we say deep tech. I mean, you're really talking about just going into the entire system. The organization, management, every aspect is going to be digitized. Shue-Jane, you work a lot with the U.S. government on this stuff. Are you seeing this kind of, let's say, organizational anthropology change in the U.S. government and how it approaches things like logistics?
Yes, absolutely. Quite interesting, if I may, kind of go back to, we talk about AI here.
Yep.
AI really is a must. I mean, everybody's using AI today to certain degrees. And think about this. It's not just us using AI. The bad actors are using AI as well. And think about it. If you were the bad actors, you got to think like a hackers. What would they do? They will attack your AI as opposed to your generic data. So while we're talking about AI, let's not forget you have to protect AI as well, first of all. Second of all here is that, in the cybersecurity, we're leveraging AI to do the threat detection. Think about that. Detecting threat is only step number one. What do you do next? Is to be able to automate your process in a smart way so you can defer the attack. And lastly here is very importantly, like my panelist was talking about, is how you be able to predict the trend of your threat environment. And now, lead into the next question here, we talk about supply chain, right? Supply chain is not just that first tier suppliers. We're talking second tier, third tier. We also are not just talking about the software that deliver to your shop. You also talk about middleware. They are spyware embedded in the middleware. They are spyware embedded in your hardware. even embedded in your second tier or third tier service providers environment. And so those attacks can be coming from all different directions. Okay, now how do we deploy AI? We got a very complex problem here. And this is why I think coming down to the bottom line here is AI is not a linear problem. It's a non-linear problem. And that's why cybersecurity today, I'm still hearing a lot of folks talk about cybersecurity. They always talk about we'll do A, then B, then C in the serial thinking. Paradigm shift. I think security meltdown. I think 2 years ago I've been talking about there is a cyber perfect storm. And we are in the middle of the cyber perfect storm. Because not only we have to deal with the legacy technology, we also have innovation continue coming out, blockchain, cloud, quantum computing, IoT, and you name it, tomorrow we're going to get a new term here.
Okay, so you have emphasized the threat, and you talked a little bit about data and data manipulation as being a vector, a threat vector. What about the use of source code? Is that a threat in the AI space? What are the other threats? What do you see as the most important threat as companies are deploying AI?
If you're only talking about the AI space, I would imagine not only just the source code, but also is how you deploy that AI. Think about bias opinion. I can actually manipulate your AI result by putting the bias opinion, bias algorithm into your AI. And this is why if you look at IBM actually had put, gathering 1 million facial images to do what? To bypass the bias on the skin color, on the facial shape, because the bias can actually manipulate your AI and really dilute your AI accuracies. And this is where what I'm kind of going back to security for AI. It's something that we cannot take it lightly. And this is where security first. AI is one of the technology that we are deploying, and we've got to put security first. And this is where a lot of folks talk about security by design. Think about it, security by design only for the new system you're going to deploy. How about the legacy environment? Because when you exercise AI, you're going to probably going to integrate it with, interoperable with your existing system. And that's why how you create this holistic security postures. So not only you can deploy AI, this entire ecosystem is secure.
Let me bring in Terry on this, because what Shue-Jane just brought up is, this isn't happening in a vacuum. This is coming over legacy systems. You have worked in the Pentagon. You're working with Samsung, huge institutions, huge organizations, obviously building their technologies on top of what exists. How are you making sure that those pre-existing technologies are safe?
I don't know that you can actually make sure that they're all going to be safe. What you can do, though, is make sure that as you're building your new systems, you are at least recognizing that it is going to be playing in a legacy world first. So you need to think about those vulnerabilities, and to the extent you can, try to either backfit, or the word I tend to use more now is wrap. There are ways today with that ability. If you look at it holistic, if you take AI, if you take the faster speeds, if you take the lower latency, I can build from the beginning a system that can partially wrap the legacy that's out there that will give us a higher degree of security than we have today. But I think the other thing we need to first admit, there is no perfect security.
Yep.
The other thing I tell everybody is build every system today knowing not if, but at some point it's going to be corrupted. So you heard the last panel talk a little bit about resiliency. I do think you can do pre-planned resiliency too. And I think we need to think hard about what does that mean. I mean, I remember when I first started, the first reaction you had to an attack was shut down the system. And that's pretty stupid, because then they've won. You've got to think about what you're going to do, how do you actually operate through the attack, protect part of the systems. That has probably been the weakest part of how we think about cybersecurity, not thinking about you're going to get attacked, what's the resiliency plan?
So, Rainer, you are working with the German government on these kind of questions. How are you starting to bring in these next-gen technologies into their thinking about resiliency?
What we have seen in the last, let's say, 30 years is always that if there is any regulation that could be absolutely helpful for, let's say, makes more trustworthiness inside the products. That's our experiences. We have seen a lot of development, especially in the high security area, that it's absolutely helpful to have, let's say, product certification, qualification, and so on. Otherwise, you have Wild West in the software development. Everything is possible, and you have no control about such new devices, new solutions, new software, and so on. And we have it also in other technology areas. Look at the automotive sector. I tell the story always again. For, let's say, in the 70s, we had in Germany 13,000 dead people on the roads. Then there was a regulation that all the manufacturers have to implement a security belt, but nobody used it. Then the regulation came with, at this time, 10 Deutschmark if you don't use the belt. Immediately, 90% used it. And now we have too much, but only 3,000 dead people on the road. So it shows security products could be helpful, but a regulation of the government is absolutely useful. Otherwise, the people will not invest in it, will not do it, or will not use it, because to use a belt, it's the same like switch on security products, take a smart card, take a software security on top, make any other protection, use it, switch it on, perhaps make it a little bit slower, so on. Otherwise, you will not be successful. Therefore, our way must be to have a security level which is useful and high enough on one hand, and there's a qualification behind, and therefore also artificial intelligence could be helpful to make such qualification processes faster.
So you're talking about regulation, a regulatory-centric model based on fines, based on punitive fines as being a good incentive. Gundbert, talk a little bit about the culture here in Europe. How do you think that Europe is going to create the incentive structure to A, deploy these next-gen technologies like AI, but B, create incentive structures, perhaps through regulation, that will make them safe? And how do you see that when you compare it to places like the United States or Asia? And maybe, Terry, we can get you in on this as well.
Well, luckily we have other experts in the room, like Mr. Helmbrecht and Mr. Kuhn, who will probably talk about this from a very informed government perspective. But I think there's a couple of things that I think, two things that I'd like to highlight. I think the one thing is we do see that regulation has a strong impact on businesses, obviously, and actually does trigger quite some positive things. I think we often talk about the negative things of regulation, and everyone has their philosophy about whether it's nudging or regulation you prefer more. But the one thing you do see is that all those nudges, even if they don't come with fines or so, even if it's just a sort of UN standard that gets implemented, an ISO standard, there are sort of ways of establishing practices in the industries that do create progress. So I work with a lot of companies that very strongly build their sort of security management systems around some of those standards or some regulations that they think are coming down the line. So I think there's people moving along that, and I think the European paradigm is probably slightly stronger on that side, especially the German. I think IT security law is, I think, generally recognized as a very strong law, but I think it's effective and working. I think Terry is probably a better place to talk about the US approach, but from a European perspective, it strikes me as slightly more on the nudging side, and the effect of that he'll know better. I think there's a second thing, though, that we oftentimes forget that I would like to highlight is we also need to invest into the ecosystems. And what I mean by that is I think you really, in this very deep digital world that you described, if you really want to factor as a government, you really will only factor if you also have an industry. I think I think we've historically had actually a strong industry in this. I think we have representatives sitting here. But just to give you a slight sort of like caution for warning, caution for optimism. The warning, I think, is I looked at patents of security products 10, 15 years ago, and actually Germany was in number 4, actually quite strong in a lot of the router-related security products. When we look at the current technologies that you described, blockchain, AI, moving target defense, sort of find your buzzword, then we're nowhere near that, right? We are factor 10, 20, sometimes 50 behind the patents of many other countries. Even though, and this is the positive side, there is, I think, a lot of potential. I think this is why this convention in this area is I think, a very good idea, because we have 6 million developers in Europe. That's actually more than the United States. So contrary to popular belief, we actually have a lot of potential. We just need to manage to cluster it, bundle it more, not fragment it. And I think ecosystems like in this region and other places are things that governments can support.
That's a great point. And we're going to get to some of those other buzzwords in a second. But Terry, I want to take this point about ecosystems. Gundbert mentioned the fact that ecosystems are so important in optimizing AI. How does the ecosystem, the government, university, private sector relationship when dealing with cybersecurity look in the United States when we're talking about these next-gen technologies?
So two things. First of all, I want to correct what you said. Rayner didn't say to build a rule-based or an incentive-based system. What he said was, we made seatbelts easy to use. People still didn't use them.
Right.
And then we put on a little incentive by raising the pipe. But it still had to
Negative
be...
incentive.
But it still had to be easy to use.
Right.
So one of the things I think that we've got to think about is this is all got to be a related system.
Totally.
100%. I mean, if you make something really hard to use, I mean, some of you probably lived through this in government or industry. At one time, one of my systems had a 23-character password required. Now, I don't know about you, but I have trouble remembering my name some mornings. And the 23 character, and don't write it down, don't store it anywhere.
Right.
That's stupid. People can't do that, and they're not going to do that. So you do have to balance, how do I make it easy? How do I show both corporate and consumer and their different models? That's the other difference I would tell you. You're going to have a model for a corporate structure here that will be different than the model for the consumer structure. That's okay. We do tend to think about these one models and everything has to fit. There's going to be multiple models and everything has to fit in that multiple model. So in the US, I can't give you a simple answer of how does that all work. I think you're seeing the US start to teach cybersecurity. Where's Kirsten? We're doing that at an earlier age. Doing enough of that yet? No, but it's moving in a direction. To my friend from Siemens, I do see more money being spent on security, but what I would say is that lagged our knowledge of the security problems. We started doing that at a point where I think we looked at it and said, okay, now potentially the security problem costs more money than not doing the security problem. And that's okay. I mean, that's a risk equation. And I do think you've got to understand the risk equations much better than we do today. And again, risk equation for a consumer is going to be a much different factor than a risk equation for a corporation or a risk equation for a government. I mean, we talked, one of the things I will say in the US, so one of the incentives came up, so well, we should have maybe a security tax. If I'm a government or I'm a government politician today in the US, I am probably not standing up and saying, you know, we're going to have a consumer security tax, because then I won't be in the government anymore and I won't have to worry about that problem anymore. That might, however, work in Europe because it's
Right.
a different cultural benefit. We're going to have to figure these out, and it's hard because it's case by case. What are the right balances and what's the right ecosystem that you're playing in? First thing is, define your ecosystem, and that's not easy. You've got to define the one you're playing in, and that's not easy at all to do.
Right. Shue-Jane, take up maybe some of these issues, because what Terry basically said is all these technologies that we're talking about are coming online simultaneously, and they all kind of have to fit together in some way like a puzzle. You can't pull them apart from each other. So we've talked a lot about AI. Maybe you can talk a little bit about cloud computing, because there has been a lot of developments. If we were having this conversation probably 3 years ago, this would have been primarily about cloud computing. What has been the evolution in thinking about cloud security, data storage security in the past couple of years, and where do you see us going?
Well, I think 3 years ago, when we talk about cloud computing, we all have this miracle thinking that we just have to catapult over your asset over to cloud and some kind of miracle will happen, right? 3 years after, our lessons learned today tells us that it's not as simple as it appears to be.
Right.
Otherwise, we'll be all enjoying the cloud today. Being a former meteorologist, I can tell you I probably know cloud more than anyone else, but not the cloud that we are talking about today. I think the convergence of technology today is, make the cloud environment become a lot more complex. We are not just talking about private cloud. We're not talking about community cloud. We talk multi-cloud. We talk about the cloud that actually have certain type of standard built in. In US, we have FedRAMP. from the government side, allowing us to be able to qualify, giving some credential to hold certain type of data, right? Having said that, the security from before to today, I think still is missing in terms of, really had that exclusive focus on security. So I can ask the folks in the room here, when you are, initiating your cloud migration project, do you actually have a set aside security budget just for that particular project? I don't see anybody raise your hand here, right? Very few.
Siemens.
Siemens, good for you. So what I'm saying here is that there is a majority of the play here really create a vulnerability. And think about this: the bad actor is just like us; it's opportunist. They're looking opportunity to attack. And just like the cryptocurrency today, if you look at the critical mining machines, is actually they are bad actor embedded inside behind the mining and really hijacking billions of dollars of money out of the cryptocurrency environment. That's opportunity. And so we as a smart people on the so-called good side, if you would, really need to think about when the emerging technology about to be deployed in a massive way, where is security? How do we secure the environment, not just the new technology itself, but also how you interoperable and integrate it with your existing system? As an example, your cloud migration. Have you thought about to evaluate before you migrate to the cloud your security posture, and then evaluate at the post-migration? And how do you maintain the defensive mechanism continuum of your ability to continue to monitor and control your environment and still have the single pane of the glass, you know where your threat environments are? And this is where we talk about cloud technology. However, that's added the blockchain, added the quantum computing, added the IoT, and many other new advanced AI algorithms, if you would. I would say this: those technology can be used by the good people like us, can also be used by the bad people. And also, I don't categorize people as good and bad. I think there's three groups: good, digital user, bad digital users, and then there's people in the middle have not decided which way they want to be. And they change. And those are the vulnerability is yet to be predicted. And that's the hardest one.
They're the negligent users, and that's probably the biggest population. Siemens is a company that is, at the vanguard of using some of this cloud stuff in some of the most sensitive technologies, sensitive industries. Can you talk a little bit about how you are? Shue-Jane brought up this idea of integration, but obviously there's a lot of vulnerabilities that come with integration. How are you guys reconciling, stopgap with cloud usage for things like updating software?
That's a loaded question. I mean, the scenario for us is really coming from the product side. We deploy products across 170 or so countries. The products we deploy, they have a lifespan of 20 to 30 years. So we have to not only make all those products become connected and intelligent, we also have to maintain a product life cycle of not only hardware like in the past, but also software for 20 to 30 years. Unlike the smartphones we all carry, none of them will be really supported by whoever developed them and sold them in 5 years with security updates. We have to do this in 15 and 20 years. So the software and hardware stacks we develop and deploy, we have to do this in a way so that we are pretty certain that we can support a life cycle with security updates in 20 years. So this is where things start already. Then we have the connectivity. We were talking about 5G earlier a little bit. 5G is one of many network technologies we use to connect those devices with other devices. For example, to communicate, organize them, among them before anything gets into the cloud, to pre-process data, to store data in the edge, and then the connectivity gets up into a cloud. So this is also what we have to understand. And with all the data in the cloud, we have a ton of applications and software that covers the whole life cycle, from design to production to operation to service and maintenance, and everything has to be consistent over 20 years. So this is the scenario which we have to cover and make secure. And when I said we spend a lot of money on security, it's not because we want to be poster childs or anything. We don't. It's we have to. Because if this is not going to be secure, and we are far from perfect, digitalization will not happen or will fail. We also need to get better on that. And artificial intelligence is not only on the applications. I really believe it will be able, if we do it right, to help us make things more secure if we use artificial intelligence in cybersecurity. Because what artificial intelligence ultimately usually is doing, it's kind of automating the decision process and detection process. If we bring this into cybersecurity, then this first mover advantage at least gets much smaller. Yes, they will also use it, but the first mover advantage will go not completely away, but maybe almost away. So it really is a broad scope of technology, and it's not enough for us to only look at IoT or only look at the digital twin or only look at 5G or only look at this and so on. Everything is connected with everything, and I cannot even say that artificial intelligence is more important than IoT or less important than cybersecurity or what have you. If one of these links is weak in my world, we are weak.
That is the perfect point to wrap up on and to give us a point for the next panel that we have here where we'll discuss quantum computing. But I took away two big points, which one is all these things are really connected. We're talking about a lot of disparate technologies, but they're all interlocking. You can't really disentangle them one from another. And two, the intrinsic value that we're really dealing with, and every person on this panel who's working for major organizations has a burden to bear, is the burden of trust. How do you win trust? How do you maintain trust? And that is becoming more difficult in this deep digital age. Thank you so much, panelists, and we will turn it over to Brent.